So thank you for the invitation to participate today, and it's very nice to look out and see so many familiar faces in the room as well. So exactly as Dan said, the focus of my presentation is the question of whether Russian pipeline gas will come back. But before I do turn to that subject, Dan has very kindly given me some pointers to cover as broader context before we begin. So if you'll forgive me, then I will run through a couple of those, and then we can build on that in our panel discussion. So the first question that Dan asked me was, are the UK and Europe still over-dependent on gas despite the coming LNG wave? Here I would say we are, from both a UK and an EU27 perspective, vulnerable in the sense that gas is very important and very widely used across three main sectors: power generation, space heating in the residential and commercial and industrial sector, and then obviously the generation of process heat in that industrial sector. And when you align to that the fact that we have a high degree of import dependency, this means that on a volumetric basis, we are very much exposed to the tightness of the global market. Moreover, across much of Europe, gas-fired power generation is the balancing element between the variability of electricity demand and the variability of non-dispatchable power generation, primarily wind and solar. So this leads to gas-fired power generation being the marginal price-setting element of the European power market. Now, these volume and pricing vulnerabilities were exposed in 2022 when the decline in Russian pipeline gas supply to Europe caused a steep increase in European gas and, consequently, power prices as the European market attempted to rebalance, trying to attract additional supply in the form of LNG and trying to curb demand. So the second question, which I will touch on briefly, are accelerating the energy transition or demand response or energy efficiency viable options for relying less on imported gas? So here I would say that looking ahead, the decarbonisation of the European power sector will of course reduce the volume of gas that we consume. We're already seeing within the gas research programme at OIS, we talk about wind and solar eating into gas as a sort of a baseline, baseload supplier of power generation. However, I would say that because gas-fired power generation will retain that balancing role on the national grid system, then we will still remain exposed to the pricing fluctuations attendant to that. As far as space heating goes, obviously the rollout of heat pumps and other decarbonised heating sources at large scale will be needed to curb gas consumption for space heating, but here I would suggest that this is going to take even longer than the decarbonisation of our power sector. The third question out of four, are we vulnerable economically to future disruptions, for example, from a temperamental US? I think temperamental is doing a bit of heavy lifting at the moment there. Flaky Australia or potentially misaligned Qatar? Or does the scale of the increase in LNG capacity over the next 5 years mean that there will be simply so much gas available that problems in either one or two of the big three would be manageable? Here I would suggest that over the coming 5 years, our expectation based on the final investment decisions that have been taken on the supply side and those that we fully expect to be taken, that global LNG supply will rise by 50% in the next 5 years. So that will obviously make the global market more competitive and bring down prices in the late 2020s. However, the majority of that growth in supply will be from the United States and from Qatar. And this was touched upon a little bit earlier, but I would again like to reiterate, I think, Mike, when you raised your question, that the US and Qatar are quite different in their challenges here. So from the US, you have a wide range of export terminals operated by a range of privately owned actors. So something short of export tariffs being applied to US LNG, as you say, it's the producers rather than the state that controls this. By contrast, in Qatar, Qatar Energy is obviously a state-owned company. All of the LNG production and export is concentrated in a single terminal at Ras Laffan, and there you have the more practical problem, let's say, of access to the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman to get those cargoes out to international markets. So finally, and here I don't wish to tread too much on Marc's toes, so I'll be brief, in essence, What is the best way to improve energy security while bringing down energy prices in the UK and Europe from a gas perspective? Now here I would say that physical security of supply will obviously be improved by reducing gas consumption and therefore the share of imports in consumption, in the sense that if there is any disruption to your supply, then you are seeking a smaller volume from alternative sources. But I don't think that would spare us from the pricing impact of disruption on the international market. So I think when we think about security of supply, we really have to separate out the volumetric physical security, getting hold of supplies physically, and the price that we have to pay for them. So now I will turn to the main topic of my presentation. Will Russian gas come back? So Dan suggested a couple of graphs, so I've kept it to two. The first one: how much Russian gas have we lost? Now I'm aware that in the audience we have quite a range of, let's say, levels of knowledge with regard to the subject, ranging from absolute experts to people who are focused on other areas and are maybe less familiar with some of the terminology. What we have here in this graph is the volume of Russian gas in billion cubic meters per month being supplied to Europe since January 2017 down here through to March 2025 on the far right of the graph. The reason I wanted to show this to you is because it provides a breakdown of the routes by which that Russian gas is delivered. So at the bottom in the dark blue, in case you can't see the legend here, that's Nord Stream. The red is supply delivered via Belarus, predominantly the Yamal Europe pipeline. The yellow is gas transit via Ukraine. The tiny little green sliver at the top is supply directly delivered to Finland and the Baltic states, and then the bright blue is supply via Turkish Stream, which, as mentioned in the previous panel, is the only pipeline route that is still operational. The second of my two graphs is the one that I'll leave up behind me while I conclude or deliver the rest of my presentation. So these are the pipeline routes. So obviously at the top here we have Nord Stream 1 and 2 behind that red line, the Yamal Europe pipeline via Belarus there. In terms of transit via Ukraine, I've highlighted only one route. So since May 2022, the flow of Russian gas into Ukraine occurred exclusively at Sudzha, which is what is shown here. And in terms of onward delivery to the European market, only really at Velké Kapušany or Uzhhorod on the Ukrainian side of the border into Slovakia. And then what you have at the bottom here in the green is Turkish Stream. Formerly Turkish Stream ends in Turkey, but obviously there is an onward flow up through Bulgaria, Serbia, and into Hungary, and as far north as Slovakia. Now, this key question: will Russian gas come back? Spoiler alert at the beginning of my comments here, I am of the opinion that because of the manner in which Russian pipeline gas supply was reduced, it will not be quick or easy to bring back, even if the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine is brought to an end in a manner acceptable to both Russia and Ukraine, which currently appears unlikely, and in that I would be very much in agreement with the comments in the first panel. And even if it were to prove possible, I would suggest that it will not happen before the new wave of LNG supply brings prices down and makes Russian pipeline gas far less important than it was at the beginning of 2022. So there are three elements to this, three constraints, if you like, that I think are preventing the return of Russian pipeline gas beyond its current volumes that I showed in the first graph. The first is a constraint on pipeline infrastructure. The second is a constraint on Gazprom's gas trading activities. And the third is a constraint on Gazprom's long-term contracts. So regarding the first set of constraints, the pipeline infrastructure, so Aurora previously mentioned that 3 out of the 4 routes are currently closed. I think it's illustrative to just add a little bit more detail on why those routes are closed, because as we know, there are no Western sanctions on Russian pipeline gas. It's not illegal to import and buy Russian pipeline gas. At a European level, let's say. There are certain individual EU member states that have instituted bans on the import of Russian gas, but at a pan-European level, there are no sanctions. So, Nord Stream 1. For those who are less familiar, obviously when gas is placed in a pipeline, it's inert. It needs to be pushed through by turbines. located in compressor stations. Now, obviously, for onshore pipelines, those compressor stations are placed at regular intervals. For a very long offshore pipeline of the type of Nord Stream, all that compression is done at the start of the pipeline. And in Russia, for Nord Stream 1, that is at Portovaya. Now, that Portovaya compressor station was powered by turbines manufactured and maintained by Siemens. And during the summer of 2022, between June and August, those turbines were taken offline one by one. I can get into, if you're interested, we can go into more details about the whys and wherefores, but it was predominantly related to Canadian sanctions, where those turbines should have been shipped to Canada for repair and then returned to Russia. Canadian sanctions initially prevented the return of the first pipeline. Then by the time an exemption was granted, the Russians appeared rather unwilling to continue the process of having those turbines serviced, and so the capacity of Nord Stream was gradually reduced. So thus, Nord Stream had gas in it, but was not operational at the time of the explosion on the 27th of September 2022. So to restart Nord Stream, you need to get over the turbines issue, and you need to repair the pipeline itself physically. Nord Stream 2, the pipeline was physically complete, but again not operational when the explosions happened. Now, due to a change in EU security of supply regulations between the construction of Nord Stream 1 and the construction of Nord Stream 2, there was a set of conditions that applied to Nord Stream 2 but not Nord Stream 1, which is that the operator of Nord Stream 2 needed to be approved by the Bundesnetzagentur, the German regulatory agency, just to operate the pipeline in German territorial waters. That certification had not been granted by the time the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022 and was then thereafter, let's say, suspended or frozen. In the present situation, it seems unlikely that the German government is minded to grant that certification, even if the pipeline is repaired. Just last month, the German government said that the repair of Nord Stream 1 or 2 would be the wrong direction, and that independence from Russian gas is a cornerstone of German energy security. So I don't see that coming back anytime soon. The Yamal-Europe pipeline via Belarus, on Polish territory, it's owned by an entity called Europol Gas, which was a Polish-Russian joint venture in which Gazprom was a 48% shareholder. In April 2022, the Polish government put sanctions on Gazprom, and in response, the following month, the Russian government put sanctions on Europol Gas, preventing Gazprom from utilizing the pipeline. The situation remained sort of frozen, let's say, for over a year, and then in October 2023, the Polish state-owned company Orlen took over Gazprom's share of Europol Gas. So now that pipeline is being repurposed for domestic Polish usage, and again, in the current geopolitical context, it's very difficult to imagine the Polish government offering that pipeline to Gazprom for its usage, let's say. Finally, transit via Ukraine, and we've spoken a bit more about this in panel 1. The contract for the transit of Russian gas via Ukraine expired on the 31st of December last year. The Ukrainian government, in the months leading up to this, had made its position very clear that it wants Europe to pursue independence from Russian gas. So in this regard, I would say that unless there is a significant and substantial and durable change in the geopolitical circumstances, it's unlikely that the Ukrainian government will change its position on that. Which then leaves us only with Turkish Stream. Now, I don't know how clearly you can see this on the graph, but I can explain to you that there are a series of bottlenecks. It's not just about the capacity of Turkish Stream itself. There is a certain capacity of about 54 million cubic meters per day on the Turkish-Bulgarian border, and then those bottlenecks get slightly smaller as you go up the line until you get to the border between Serbia and Hungary, about 22 million cubic meters per day. At that bottleneck, the pipeline is being operated at pretty much its full capacity. And so basically Gazprom can't increase its deliveries via Turkish Stream because of these staged bottlenecks going up the line. So if none of the other routes come back and Turkish Stream remains the only route, then Gazprom cannot increase its supplies from the present level. So what other constraints do we have? Constraints on Gazprom's trading activities. So until late 2021, Gazprom supplied gas to Europe through 3 commercial mechanisms. One was a long-term contracts with European counterparties. Secondly, trading on European exchanges through its trading subsidiaries. And then the third was the sale of additional volumes on its so-called electronic sales platform based in St. Petersburg. So what I will do is take those in reverse order. The electronic sales platform was effectively an auction platform. Gazprom could put volumes on it. European companies could go on and bid for those and receive them according to the terms and conditions of the bidding. On the 13th of October 2021, the European Commission announced an anti-monopoly investigation into suppliers it suspected of withholding volumes from the European market in the summer of 2021. It didn't name Gazprom by name, but the implication was fairly clear. Coincidentally, that was the last day on which any sales were made via the electronic sales platform, and it has since been effectively shut down. In terms of the gas trading subsidiaries, of course, the best known was Gazprom Germania and its subsidiary based here in London, Gazprom Marketing and Trading. Now, that European Commission anti-monopoly investigation that I mentioned culminated in raids on the German offices of Gazprom Germania and another trading subsidiary, Wingas, on the 30th of March 2022. In response, Gazprom seemingly panicked is perhaps the wrong word, but they tried to urgently divest itself of those subsidiaries, tried to sell them to a Russian buyer. The German government was obviously very concerned about security of supply implications for Germany and blocked the sale. Gazprom then simply abandoned those subsidiaries and stopped supplying them with gas that they could then sell on into the market. So Gazprom Germania was nationalised by the German government under its new name, Secure Energy for Europe, SEFI. So I would suggest that without its trading subsidiaries, Gazprom is going to find it very difficult to come back to the European traded market, which then leaves Gazprom in the situation that it's in right now, which is only supplying gas under long-term contracts. And here I would say there are two key considerations. Firstly, 31st of March 2022, Russian presidential decree stating that Gazprom's European long-term contract counterparties had to pay for their gas henceforth in Russian rubles as opposed to in dollars or euros. The mechanism by which that would be achieved would involve the European companies setting up bank accounts in Russia and those Russian banks facilitating that currency exchange. Now, several European companies simply refused and had their supplies cut off. So then you're left by let's say, the later part of 2022, once these other physical supply routes have also been cut off, you have a number of European companies whose supplies have been cut off, suspended, however you choose to term it, either due to the refusal to pay in rubles or the curtailment of pipeline capacity. Either way, many of these European companies then launched commercial arbitration cases against Gazprom. In the time that it's taking those cases to work their way through the arbitration courts, several of those contracts have expired, not been renewed, seemingly will not be renewed. A couple of the contracts have been terminated, and then the rest remain effectively suspended. Now, the key point here is that Gazprom argues that it won't get a fair hearing in European arbitral tribunals, and so has been pursuing anti-suit injunctions in Russian commercial courts, effectively seeking damages from European companies who are committing the unfriendly act of putting Gazprom through European-based commercial arbitration, seeking awards effectively equivalent in size to those being granted by the European companies in their European-based commercial arbitrations. So, Gazprom is clearly unlikely to pay any award that is made by a European commercial arbitral tribunal, and as long as those awards remain unpaid, Gazprom's assets in Europe are liable for seizure, which is one of the things that prevents Gazprom from re-establishing trading subsidiaries in Europe. So, to summarise, in terms of pipeline routes, the restart of deliveries via Ukraine I would consider to be the least likely of a selection of very unlikely options. Even if Gazprom gets more access to pipeline capacity to increase its deliveries, it will struggle to find counterparties to take its gas. No one will trust Gazprom enough to sign a new term contract, especially given the outcome of these arbitral tribunals. Why would you sign a new term contract with someone if you know that should a dispute arise, you can't get a reasonable commercial arbitral settlement of that dispute? Moreover, Gazprom can't sell into the European stock into the European traded market because it no longer has access to these trading subsidiaries. So, in short, to come back to my spoiler at the beginning, I don't think Russian pipeline gas is going to rebound from its present level anytime soon, and that if it eventually does, it will come back into a market that is much more well supplied with LNG, much more competitive, and a very much looser market than the one from which it stepped away in 2022. So, that's me.
Thank you very much. Great, so we'll start the panel now, and we can bring Amelia in on remotely. So, just to introduce, I mean, we will be talking a little bit more about the kind of near and medium term. In the last panel, it was more about ceasefire politics in Ukraine. Here we'll talk a little bit more about energy security going forwards, policy in a few different areas. So, just to go through the panel, we have Sid Kaushal, my colleague here from RUSI, Senior Research Fellow, who will talk a bit about defence of infrastructure and security, physical security of offshore in particular, and especially in the energy transition. Obviously we have Jack, who you've met already. We have Marc, who is from Aurora RE, Head of Research for Western Europe and India.
That's correct.
And Professor Amelia Hadfield, joining us online. I'm very pleased to have you interrupting your holiday. Apologies for that, so thank you for joining, who is Head of Politics at the University of Surrey, amongst several other titles. So thanks, Jack, for the introductory comments. I think it is really useful and kind of enlightening, especially for people not so familiar with the energy sector, to see how complex the process was of removing Russian gas from Europe, and how kind of, in some senses, uncoordinated. But also, to bear in mind, I think for people looking from afar, the energy industry can seem fairly simple. There's lots of gas coming from Russia, there's less gas, now the prices are high. But the reality of energy is that the devil is always in the detail. Yes. And it can't just come back. These big dynamics are determined by contractual disputes, by small regulatory changes, by legal procedures. So understanding that is kind of key to trying to understand what are the prospects of Russian gas, and also if Russia is negotiating, what kind of things will it look for if it wants its gas to come back to Europe? Will it try pipelines? Maybe it will focus on LNG instead. So we have a slight rearrangement of what we were going to do. Sid unfortunately has to leave at 4:30, so we'll go to defence quite early. But I did want to just ask you a quick couple of follow-up questions from your presentation, Jack, on, firstly, you've talked about a lot of commercial reasons. I mean, really, these are fundamentally commercial in most cases, except for when pipelines are physically blown up, or regulatory. Now, commercial disputes can obviously last for absolutely forever. In some ways, it's a much more durable form of ending use of Russian gas than sanctions. But what I wanted to ask is, it all sounds very hard to overcome, but if there was political will, for whatever reason, because of a change in negotiations, because of a change of priorities, could they actually be overcome much quicker than it might look now?
So I think in terms of the commercial arbitration cases, it would require political will on both sides, because it would require Gazprom to participate fully in those arbitration tribunals. It would require effectively the Russian government putting pressure on Gazprom to settle those cases, to be honest. So it's not just about a European willingness to take Russian gas. If the Russian government basically pushed Gazprom to settle some of these cases where the contracts have not expired or been terminated, but are merely suspended, then that would be one way of reactivating those contracts. Similarly, I would say that any constraints around payment in rubles versus payment in euros and dollars is something that could be rectified from the Russian side by a change of government policy. So there are levers, let's say. I guess what I really wanted to highlight in my remarks is just how complicated it is, that it wouldn't be sufficient for Trump to grab Zelensky's arm and twist it up behind his back and force even to use the term peace deal. I think in the first panel we've seen, and I would very much agree with the comments in the first panel, how difficult a peace agreement would be to achieve and a change in geopolitical circumstance. But you would need that in order to try and overcome some of the challenges that I mentioned. Just one other thing I should say, and I forgot to mention in my presentation, this is also a rather shameless plug for a paper that I published through OIS about 2 weeks ago. It's available on our website, precisely with this title of, I think I called it No Way Back, referring to Russian gas, and it was my sort of detailed analysis of all of these reasons that I tried to summarize in my presentation. So, to answer your question, political will is a necessary but not perhaps in and of itself sufficient condition for some of these flows to come back.
Thanks. And then just very quickly, I also wanted to respond to one of the questions in the first panel where, which wasn't on the agenda, but perhaps is worth mentioning, and I'm sure you and Marc together can put to bed definitively, absolutely forever, which is the North Sea and UK, in particular, especially European energy security. How relevant in reality is it in terms of the volumes in the UK, the volumes coming into Europe, and compared to the really big sources of gas, LNG, Norway, Russia? Like, what role does it really play, and is it damaging energy security to be potentially winding it down, I guess, quicker than would otherwise potentially happen?
So I think this comes back to the question of granting new licenses in the North Sea. The North Sea is a mature basin, and so I think that any additional licenses, any additional investment that might otherwise not take place would have the impact of maybe slowing the rate of decline of production in the North Sea rather than kick-starting a boom of new and rising production volumes, let's put it that way. You said maybe Marc might chime in.
I'm happy to chime in. I think at the turn of the century, like domestic production in the UK was meeting demand. Today, like domestic production is more like meeting maybe half of demand or like total supply. And in the mid-2030s, it will be meeting like a quarter, maybe a third. And so providing new licenses and allowing to drill more in the North Sea would potentially move the needle a little bit from like 1%, 2% increase of like how much of the total demand is going to be supplied by domestic production, but it's unlikely to change the direction of travel, which is that domestic production will provide less and less as a share of demand, like UK gas demand. And I think that also it would be quite expensive. It's difficult to see how that incremental production will be economic. And also it just sends such a strange signal to the industry at a time when to cope with a sort of like depletion of like the UK continental shelf, we need to invest a lot into renewables or other types of like low carbon generation. So there's a strong need for like clear investment signal to deploy large amount of capital in the power sector. While I think on the gas production side, the upside is very limited. So.
Right, thank you very much. So put to bed, you'll never hear that argument ever again from anybody. North Sea is important for UK energy security, but it is marginal, and we could get into price, but let's get back to the agenda. I'll also throw my panel into complete disarray by changing the order so that we can maximise our use of SID. So we're talking today, mostly we've been talking about Russian gas, and it's not coming into Europe because of the war, so the implications on energy security of the war. But obviously, the other major concern is an aggressive Russia, and what that means for the security of European infrastructure, especially offshore, and in particular grey zone, really. So, I mean, I think we're not necessarily really thinking here about outright attacks, obvious missile strikes and things like that. We're talking about things that are deniable, things that are deniable, cause lots of damage. So my kind of first question is, firstly, how much has the risk grown, and how should this impact, our thinking about offshore energy? And secondly, is there a chance, what is the chance really over time as we put more, especially kind of offshore wind in the middle of the North Sea, and we have more interconnectors and things like that, is there a chance that defence, whether the MOD or the armed forces, at some point turns around and says, actually, we're going to have to slow down on this, or we're going to have to stop because we can't physically defend it, or the cost is going to be prohibitive, and we end up with delay? So just some thoughts on that would be interesting.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for the question and the opportunity to participate in the conversation. I'd say to the first question, there's definitely likely to be an increase in Russian intent in this direction. And the Russians have talked in this about critical infrastructure as essentially the Achilles heel of a modern society for a rather long time. 20 years ago, a retired Russian major general called Vladimir Slipchenko wrote a book in which he said, the life support systems of a modern society are its center of gravity. And I think that's very much informed their thinking in a whole range of areas, how they employ missiles against the energy grid, as we've seen in Ukraine, but also with respect to critical infrastructure. I think right now there's a bit of a trade-off, particularly when you're not in a hot war between deniability and impact. And, when a system has a great deal of redundancy, you kind of have to pick one as the attacker. You can conduct an attack on a deniable basis, but it's relatively fixable, or you can conduct attacks on a scale, which probably mean you have actually given the other side a casus belli. And I think that's why, gas is an area of particular interest when it comes to undersea infrastructure. When you look at transatlantic cables, there's a great deal of redundancy, but gas pipelines are a whole matter entirely. When you talk about things like wind farms, I think right now we would probably be looking at systems with enough redundancy collectively that actually that deniability impact trade-off is something the attacking side really does have to contend with. So that would be my first observation. That being said, in the gray zone, something doesn't necessarily have to be impactful in order to be useful. It depends what you're trying to achieve. You might also be trying to send a political signal, in which case it's more the brazenness of the act than the material impact which matters. Setting ammunition sort of facilities in Europe on fire, or sending death threats to the CEOs of European defense industrial companies have not really shut European defense industry down, but that wasn't the point. They were an exercise in coercive signaling and risk manipulation. And there's a bit of an inversion of the deniability impact sort of conundrum I mentioned. Actually, you do want to target something that maybe doesn't shut an entire system down, because now you've escalated a bit too far. You want to do enough damage to signal intent, but not necessarily, go all the way. And something like a wind farm might be an ideal target. So I think, the adversary strategy is the first factor to consider. The second, even though I know we're talking primarily about the gray zone, I think it links to your question about whether the defense sector might, find itself overwhelmed. In wartime, at least as things stand now, the problem is somewhat simplified by the fact that many of the systems you might use to target critical infrastructure, for example, an autonomous underwater vehicle like the Harpsichord, which is one of the autonomous systems the Russians use for deep sea surveillance and potentially interfering with the infrastructure. It has to be carried by something, whether that's a vessel like the Yantar or a special purpose submarine like the Belgorod, which is a rather large Oscar-class submarine that they've stretched to act as a mothership for autonomous systems, amongst other things. But these are platforms you stand to lose in a conflict, right? They're safe in the sort of competition short of conflict space because the rules of engagement against them are quite limited. But I think 10 years from now, we might be looking at a very different landscape, because the endurance of many autonomous systems is only growing. For example, the Cetus AUV, which MSubs is building for the Royal Navy, is meant to endure at sea for around 5 days. Another commercial UUV called the Solus LR, which is meant to have, which is also sort of entering the market, is intended to have a range of around 2,000 kilometers. And, the Russians are building their own analogs to these systems. If you can, deploy UUVs and AUVs at very long distances without the need for a mothership. The risk-reward sort of calculus changes for the attacker. You no longer necessarily have to put something extraordinarily valuable at risk to target infrastructure. That widens your target set because suddenly you're not paying a really significant price for each piece of infrastructure you're targeting. And it also really complicates the task of surveillance and defense for navies because, even though autonomous systems are not necessarily difficult to detect right now, based on what we know about their propulsion systems, an average large UUV has a noise level of about 110 to 120 decibels at 1 meter, which just for perspective, that would be unacceptable for a submarine entering service. So it's not that they're difficult to detect, but when there's a lot of them, that necessarily complicates the challenge. So I do think that second aspect of the question, defensive systems being overwhelmed by just the sheer number of attacking targets is going to become an even more acute problem. Not necessarily now, but perhaps in a 10-year time frame.
Is that better? Yeah, there we go. Apologies. So one of the things we've been thinking about a little bit more, and I've certainly been thinking about, is whether in the energy transition you have a change in the geography of the energy system, and it brings a lot of offshore infrastructure that is just physical infrastructure covering large areas in the middle of the sea. In some ways, that's hard to defend, but in other ways, you've got large infrastructure in the middle of the sea, and it's got great sensors, and some of these sensors are actually quite affordable and commercial and things like that. They already measure acoustics around, both interconnectors and around wind turbines. There's potential to put sensors on these. There's shared infrastructure potential. How much potential do you see potential in using this, integrating this kind of infrastructure a bit more thoroughly with the kind of security defense architecture to actually improve security? Are there opportunities to actually reduce the costs of maritime surveillance and security, or is it all cost?
No, I think you're definitely right that there are opportunities here, and the big area of opportunity I see is the sort of ancillary sensors that are used for tasks like maintenance or sort of essentially checking the status of undersea infrastructure. And we see this already in the oil and gas sector, right? Norway's gas sector is a larger user of uncrewed underwater vehicles than the Norwegian Navy, which is why when the Lofoten cable was cut a little while ago, the Norwegian Navy actually started harvesting data from some of the UUVs that the gas sector was using. And that's going to be true, of other offshore infrastructure as well. The ability to monitor and maintain it will depend on uncrewed systems. And that, I think, matters for defense because, one of the reasons defense expenditure is so high is defense as a market is relatively small. There is only a single military to which you can sell any single thing. So, and usually it's quite specialized. You can't necessarily take commercial off-the-shelf systems and repurpose them for defense. But more and more you see across nations efforts to to change that, to rely more on commercial systems, especially in the uncrewed space. That's been most obviously true of drones, aerial UAVs, but I think that's going to be a major factor at sea as well. And, in some nations have been pretty ahead of the curve in this space. So, China is a good example where the PLA essentially runs a bidding system called DroneNet, where commercial providers can pitch sort of the repurposing of their products for military roles. And one example is an oil and gas UUV, which could have a towed array sonar attached to it. And, some of those projects will crash, some of them will probably take off. But the ability to actually generate economies of scale that drive down the unit costs of some of the things that you use for surveillance and potentially also interdiction is going to be critical for defense in this space. And the only way I think that driving down that unit cost is going to be possible is if the defense sector is attached to a larger market of which it is one part, and therefore, producers can drive down unit costs. And yeah, I think the sensors associated you mentioned could be one big part of that answer.
Thanks. And just one really brief final question. I mean, how do you go about linking this up and coordinating? So at the moment, I've heard complaints, for example, from a major European subsea cable manufacturer, basically saying, we've got absolute loads of data, we've got amazing kind of sensors and stuff, but we don't really know who to give it to. And some countries are quite good, other countries, we detect, we know there's a threat, but it takes a day before we can find the right person at the right ministry. Obviously, NATO is doing things, but yeah, it would be good to hear your views, clearly more could be done.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, and this varies by country. So, for example, in the UK, we have an especially fragmented system where, the police have investigative authority out to 12 nautical miles. The Royal Navy typically takes responsibility further out. Responsibility for different bits of critical undersea infrastructure is held across different ministries. Whereas, if you look within France, for example, there's a very different picture. There is a single senior maritime prefect, typically the most senior naval officer in charge, and his office is essentially the framework which draws in sort of relevant information from across the other actors who may be relevant in this space. So I do think there are good organizational models that exist, not far from us, just across the channel, which could be quite easily leveraged. But I'd say, yeah, on a country-specific basis, this can get much harder. And I'd say in our country in particular, there's a real fragmentation of the system of authorities and jurisdictions, which is probably a major area to fix.
Thanks. So I'll just take questions for Sid, if there are any, because obviously he has to leave it early. So if anyone has any questions on the kind of defence sabotage side of things, that'd be great. And then we'll turn to, if not, we'll turn to, energy security and those kind of questions. So have one here at the front, if that's okay, and over to you.
Yeah, it's just it's not so much a question as an observation, and I'd love your thoughts on it. So when you're talking about critical national infrastructure as the soft underbelly of Western society, I think that's exactly the right way to think about it. The unmanned systems are only one way that you can take out a critical node that causes, a cascade of problems, right? And then we get into things like cybersecurity, and RUSI itself had a paper about, there was salt typhoon and salt, what was the other one?
Volt typhoon. Yeah.
Volt typhoon, yeah. Exactly. So the idea that, there's a, 0 day in cyber in the electricity grid or something, and you could just shut it down. But you don't even need to have it be systemic. You can just, have one. And there's so many different ways. There's the cyber way. There's the unmanned vehicle way. Do you see what I mean? And we're so vulnerable, right? And I don't think that we're responding adequately, right? Because we also still have this idea that civil and defense are somehow separate. They're not, right? So those are my observations. I know there is a question in there somewhere. Maybe you can find it.
No, and I think you're absolutely right. In some ways, the conversation about critical infrastructure is nested within a wider conversation about targeting a society's strategic rear areas. And this is very much how the Russians talk about it, right? A strategic operation to destroy critically important targets, as they describe it, is fairly sort of approach agnostic. It would probably involve targeting infrastructure. It would also involve things like missile attacks on power stations on the ground or cyber attacks. And that's, of course, important because what you're trying to do as the attacker, if you're in a really high-intensity conflict, is deny the system you're attacking its reversionary mechanism. So you almost want a full-court press that isn't tied to one single vector of attack. So I think that's definitely true. And I suppose the implication of what you mentioned is because responsibilities for different parts of that picture sit across different parts of the system right now. Some bits are seen as a matter of civil defense or indeed not a defense concern at all, whereas others, air attack or missile attack is seen as a clear hard defense issue. The system itself is currently a bit siloed, so I guess conceptually and organizationally, these things should be seen as part of a single approach, because that's certainly how the Russians would see them.
I think there definitely is a case for rethinking how we perceive the kind of multiplicity of security threats. I mean, certainly I was speaking to one of the major offshore wind developers recently in their security team, and he basically says, we were asked to assess single points of failure in our offshore wind, and we was just everywhere. It's just, there are hundreds. And so I think but in that kind of situation, it just involves really rethinking what you mean and how you approach it. You need a much more flexible approach that's not kind of point by point by point, taking off each check, or different ways of conceiving the problem. Yes.
Jonathan Stern from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Thought I'd just interject this comment. I could have done it in the last session. For those people who are not very familiar with particularly natural gas pipeline infrastructure, offshore or onshore, the instances of nasty people doing nasty things to infrastructure are massively outweighed by just failures of infrastructure, which have caused endless problems. And the idea that no one's looked at the frailties of pipelines, pipelines have been designed from the start to try and avoid these kind of incidents. Lots of pipelines were never built around the world because they were looked at as too vulnerable. The key thing here, which is really for me a massive kind of bizarre situation, is the one pipeline which has been destroyed as a result of a terrorist incident, i.e. Nord Stream, is something that no one has really bothered to look into in a very forensic way, because what we sort of understand is that 2 Ukrainians were responsible for it, but nobody tracked them down. And I think that is an incredible irony, given the fascinating stuff that we're hearing on the platform as to how this could happen. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's elements of that, but I do think that it's fair to say that there was a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of thinking about offshore pipeline security. I mean, certainly, again, I don't want to reveal who I was talking to, but I was recently hearing, effectively when Nord Stream was blown up, quite a lot of the infrastructure, the pipeline operators and owners in the North Sea basically said, okay, we've switched, we have to switch, we've had a safety culture, now we're switching to a security culture. And directly as a result of Nord Stream, they ran surveys of their entire pipeline networks, like thousands of kilometers, to check for threats. They're kind of reorienting how they think about it. So I think clearly, I'm not going to argue with the point. I mean, clearly maintenance is or failure is a massive issue. But I do think there's been a change in operation as well, and the kind of operational approach to it. And, and that will feed into policy eventually, potentially, and that's where I think it gets potentially interesting. But we could discuss that later. I think we should move on to energy security and some of the kind of questions there. So, thank you very much for those comments. And if you do need to go to your meeting, feel free to go. Yes, thank you very much. So, moving back to energy, I think we've been talking about. Well, you in particular said we're over-dependent on gas, was one of your points, despite kind of the coming LNG wave. If we are, how do we become less dependent? What can be done near term? Because it seems when you think about the options that we're really actually quite constrained. You don't want to use Russian gas, well, you can use LNG, but we don't necessarily want to do that. We're using too much gas, so we want to use renewables, but that's also very difficult. There's a lot of grid things, but there are other things that could be done. So it'd be nice to hear what they could be. So.
Okay, so first of all, in terms of the question of being over-dependent on gas. I think there is a balance to be struck. I don't wish to sort of step on Marc's toes too much, but I would suggest that what we've seen, let's say, over the last 5 years, right, in terms of energy transition and reducing the use of gas, is that it's a slow, complex, and occasionally expensive transition to achieve. And so in that regard, the extent to which we can reduce our dependency on gas in the coming 5 years is going to have sort of that there will be a reduction in gas use over the next 5 years, because once you've installed a heat pump in your home, you're not going to go back to putting a gas boiler in, for example. But there will be limits to how much we can get away from gas in the next 5 years. And so it's the question is sort of partly about how much gas you're using, but it's also partly about how resilient your supply of gas is. If you sort of accept that, you know, if you take the UK, something like 85% of homes are heated with gas boilers. You know, what's the chances of that number being substantially lower by 2030, and how much lower could it possibly be? You're still going to have a lot of homes that use gas for their heating, and so the resilience of gas physical supply remains a very important one. But I don't wish to say too much, because I know that Marc is going to step in on this, so I'll pass this along.
So sorry, I can maybe add to that. So yes, think about like, I want to start to discuss gas security of supply, and then if I can say a few words about power, right, electricity security of supply, because it's kind of like linked ultimately. Especially we're in a world where in Europe and in the UK in particular, like gas demand is declining, and it is declining especially because there is a gradual transfer, a switch from using gas directly as a primary source of energy, like for heating in homes, for instance, to power again. Like think about like building heating is moving slowly to power, but also like electrification of like vehicles, that's more like for oil, but also you can think also like of within the power sector, a switch from like gas-fired generation for like a huge of the base load needs to more and more like renewable generation, and then gas remaining only for those like marginal hours when we need some balancing. So just with that in mind, I want to start a little bit with some consideration, not answers, around gas security of supply. Just like also to put things in context, at the moment about 1/3 of the UK's primary energy is imported. So I think that's where we're talking about when we're thinking about like security of supply. And gas is about 40%, give or take, of the UK's like primary energy demand. And also, like as we've discussed just before, like domestic production is declining in the UK, and so that gives like more and more weight on like imports. And in the UK, like the choice has been made like about 15, 20 years ago to go quite full onto LNG supplies, more than developing like further interconnections with like other countries. Like the key reason is there are not like that many other countries that can actually supply more to the UK. Norway is also like peaking in terms of like production. The Netherlands are also like declining quite fast, so there's not like that many pipeline sources across like around the UK. So the LNG market was kind of like a no-brainer, but also like the key rationale as to why going for like the LNG market is that it provides like diversity of supply, and increasingly it's a market that is becoming liquid. So I think that provides some kind of like security of supply credentials. One thing that I would note about gas security of supply in the UK is that, interestingly, there's been a bit of a lack of faith in the role of storage by government. And so it's just something that I note and I would place out there. Yes, so like that being said, and even though like domestic supply is declining, the future of kind of like gas infrastructure margins is still like reasonably strong and robust in the UK because that demand is going down. So overall, the way we think about security of supply in the gas system in GB in particular is around two key items. One is around diversity of supply, so the ability therefore like to not rely on like one single supplier, but also, and I think that answers a little bit your point, there's everything is based on a sort of like N-1 rule, so thinking about like the loss of the largest piece of infrastructure in the system. So there is some redundancy base, like that is factored in the system, and I completely agree with that. Like, yes, it could be done, like, we may lose something because, like, some malevolent person may do something, but also a lot of the time it just happens because the equipment breaks. That is a reality thing. So I think, like, the cause is almost, like, irrelevant here, but there is some redundancy built in the system. And I think that's how, like, security of supply is built. And actually, it's been quite successful, because if we reflect to the beginning of the war in Ukraine, when there was obviously like a drop in gas supply to Europe, actually the UK started as an exporter to Europe through its LNG system that could import from the rest of the world and then deliver through its interconnectors to continental Europe. And I think that was something that was mentioned in the keynote address earlier. So it shows that it is working. It is working at a high price. I'm not disagreeing, but when we think about energy security, it's really about the volumetric aspect, as you mentioned, and we need to put aside the sort of like cost or affordability aspect, which is, I think, in my mind, a different topic. And if I expand a little bit, like to a sort of like European point of view, we've seen that since the beginning of the war, a lot of European countries have essentially followed the same route, because there's been a lot of regasification terminals that have been announced. Not all of them have been deployed, but there's still like quite a lot of new regas capacities that have been deployed across Europe, which in a way allows Europe today to to satisfy its demand without, as we've seen, like most of Russian pipeline imports. I'm happy to move to sort of like electricity security of supply, but I'm also happy to pause first in case you want to add to that, or if anyone wants to contribute to that before we move to power.
Well, I think let's move on to power. And I think rather than framing it just in terms of power, like I think that one of the interesting questions is, is the policy mix right? If we're thinking about energy security, security of supply, but also including affordability within that, in the sense that, if as we saw in 2022, like a kind of £60 billion cost to the Treasury has some long-lasting impacts. So is the policy mix in the UK and Europe right for this at the moment? And are issues beyond power, like building, heating, transportation, especially kind of demand side, flexibility, are they being kind of adequately addressed and dealt with?
Would you like to start?
No, you.
Okay.
Please go ahead. I'll
Sure. Yes. So I think, so speaking about, so we said that gas essentially, especially gas use, is declining. So obviously there are some concerns and consideration to be had around security of supply, but as the power system is growing, and is growing for two reasons, and security of supply in power is growing for two reasons. One, because within the power system, we're moving away from gas-fired generation to like renewable intermittent generation. So that's one thing. And two, also the power system itself is growing, or will grow, especially over the next 10 years, because we're moving to electrifying a lot of aspects of our life. We can think about heating, we can think about transport. Also, and I think we started to discuss it earlier, like there's some like AI consideration, like data centers are a big topic at the moment. And even in the UK, there's actually like a reasonably strong pipeline that may add some pressure to the system. So in terms of demand, we're seeing like demand growing. Now, if we think about like how do we think about security of supply in an electricity system context? So you need to think about what share of demand is inflexible, so your peak inflexible demand. And actually that peak inflexible demand is about to grow quite massively over the next like 10 years, about like plus 10 gigawatt compared to today. So going to like roughly we'll need like a dispatchable power capacity that will need to meet something like 67 gigawatts in 2035, which is a lot more than the like roughly 55 gigawatts of today. And obviously there's a range of technologies that can do that, and we can touch on demand just after, promise. There's a range of technologies that are capable of providing security of supply in a sort of like firm dispatchable way. We can think of like nuclear, long duration storage, BECCS, so like biomass with carbon capture. All of those are great, and they're low carbon and sound ideal, but they take over a decade to build. So when we think about like short to medium term, what's going to happen in the next 10 years, these are sort of like out of the question. Can think also about batteries. There's a lot of discussion about batteries. It's kind of like, it's very trendy. However, batteries, as we know them, are very limited in duration, and therefore they're very poorly derated by the system, which means that they contribute very little to security of supply. For instance, if you have like an episode of like 3 days without wind, a 2-hour battery is not necessarily going to help you that much. So what is left to deploy like reasonably fast over the next like 10 years? You can think about like gas peakers. I think this is like the best option and the most like realistic option. That's why like I'm saying that there will be some at least like residual like gas use in the system, in the power system, but also like from a fuel in the first place. It might not be like a lot of hours run per year. It might be just as a backup capacity, but it will be there. However, there's kind of like 2 challenges into delivering that sort of like security of supply in the power mix. One is due to the sort of like incompatibility of unabated gas with all the net zero targets and the current like framework of policy. We've seen that the sort of like pipeline for new build gas has completely collapsed since like 2018. In 2018, in the latest capacity market, in the 2018 capacity market auction, there was about like 14 gigawatt of gas that entered. In the recent one that just completed a few weeks ago, early March, there was under 1 gigawatt. So the pipeline has completely dried out, and it's due to like a number of reasons. There's like development and planning reasons. It's actually quite difficult to get the planning permission, the grid connection, the siting, because your gas plants need to be like hydrogen ready, and there's only so many locations that will enable that. There's also issues around like the sort of like business case, because for instance, like the capacity market requires now the capacity market has a cap, which is a bit too low to justify new investments into like for instance CCGTs. It would not allow for like everything, or like so it would only allow for some kind of like specific gas peakers. Anyway, there's also like a lot of like policies that are probably like not supporting that. We can think of like the upcoming like capacity market reform that is about to deliver, but it's been in discussions for like quite a few years. So that's reducing a bit the interest of a lot of developers. So anyway, there's a lot of things. The second item that I wanted to mention is also about the existing fleet. So we have an issue with like finding a new build, but also the existing fleet, which will retire. A lot of it will retire like by 2035, so about half of it. So what you need to think about is like, okay, how can we extend the sort of like lifetime of those assets, because that is actually quite critical to your system. But then again, for that, we need to think about what is the right environment for investors, for developers to actually want to do that, to make sure that there are like the right financial incentive, that there's the right kind of long-term outlook, because I mentioned fewer and fewer run hours for gas plants. So who wants to invest in a plant that will do nothing? It can create a lot of like issues, also operational. And also when you want to extend the lifetime of a plant, you need to switch it off and take it offline for about 1.5 years. So during that 1.5 years, you may also have like security of supply concerns. So there's a lot of things here to consider, like going back to like policy and whether the policy is right. There's a number of like regulatory tools that the government has in its pocket to try and deal with that. One is around like organizational remit of a lot of the government bodies. We can think of like the NISO, the grid operator, that now actually has not a sort of like electricity thinking or like gas thinking, but a sort of like whole system approach, which I think is like very useful in this context when you think about both like gas markets and power markets. Also, we need to have like greater market transparency to ensure that markets function better. We need to think about network reforms, because again, there's an issue of like the grid, which is not quite fit for purpose, and finding like grid connection is increasingly difficult. Reforming market structures. I mentioned like there's a lot of discussion around like key markets that are being reformed, but it's taking a lot of time, and that is dampening a lot of the investment appetites from a lot of developers. So if you think of like the capacity market, for instance. And then also there's been like a couple of like recent announcements. So at the end of last year, like Clean Power 2030, which actually is helping in the sense that it is securing, at least in terms of announcement, a sort of like room for gas in the power system, and not saying that there will not be gas. So this is helpful. And we can deep dive on this one a little bit more if helpful. And the last one is REMA. I don't know if all of you have heard of REMA. Is the Review of Electricity Market Arrangement. Is this kind of like all-encompassing, potentially massive reform of the electricity market, which will conclude in the next couple of weeks/month, and may actually decide to either maintain the GB system in a single national pricing system or to go to a zonal market. I'm mentioning that not because it has a direct impact on security of supply, but because if we're going to zonal, all the sort of like bandwidths of Whitehall, parliamentary, everything, even the industry, when thinking about energy, will be on that, and therefore not on any of the security of supply concerns for the next 10 years.
Thanks. So lots of questions, but I'm quite conscious of pulling Amelia away from her holiday and making sure we get some questions. So in the current context of Russia, the negotiations that are happening, it's perhaps more important, and certainly it's more obvious to everybody than it has been since Brexit, that the EU and UK could better align on some of these issues, and that perhaps there is and has developed quite a lack of alignment on energy issues, with perhaps the electricity markets not working as efficiently as they could, on priorities and things like supply chains as well, where, you know, when you talk about not using Chinese suppliers for wind, you get the response from Treasury of, well, why would we subsidize your jobs in Europe when they're not manufacturing here? So how can the UK and EU align better? I mean, are they better aligned than I'm characterizing? But could they do it better? And also, how can they make their voice heard when it comes to energy security discussions, especially with the US and Russia, who really with the US really, who are not listening?
Thanks, folks. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation and for putting up with me not being in the room. So hopefully the Wi-Fi will hold out and you're hearing me clearly enough. Really enjoyed the panel so far. Jack's keynote, Sid's fantastic observations, and just now those of Marc. So I've been taking assiduous notes, which is always one of the nice things about being able to participate. So I think you're right. I think the UK and the EU are simply not sufficiently aligned on a variety of energy questions. You asked specifically to look at markets and security and also industrial policy. And I'll start with misalignment, if you like, in the electricity market area, simply because that's what we've been touching on. I have to say this delicately. I mean, the Commission itself it needs to think carefully about the long-term risks of advising its member states not to allow the UK deeper access to the bloc's electricity markets. That stance, of course, feels very redolent of Brexit era's issues, EU's sort of no cherry picking principle towards the UK. And, not surprisingly, the EU stance on limiting UK access to energy markets reflects, I think, probably a broader reluctance to allow sectoral participation without full single market membership. But that's not on the cards at this point. And on the other side, of course, you've got the UK government's continuing adoption of red lines, which in turn constrains its ability to pursue deeper integration in some areas. But this degree of misalignment, I think, really runs against increasingly clamorous calls from European and British energy companies themselves for really quite a radical rewrite of post-Brexit energy trading arrangements. And we flirted with this a little bit earlier, to create this sort of green energy hub in the North Sea. And certainly, I think the opportunities there are enormous. That lack of alignment is really problematic for offshore wind development, for lots of other areas, but specifically, I think, sectorally for offshore wind. So to my mind, improved EU-UK cooperation on offshore wind could likely deliver significant benefits. Now, I've seen a variety of numbers thrown around, but sort of in the area of 40 or 44 billion, possibly euro in savings to consumers by 2035, probably 2040. And certainly a significant reduction in investment costs as well. So certainly the current arrangements are not good. They are suboptimal. And we've already seen a slowdown, and we've talked a little bit already about the North Sea, but I think that's deterring investment in turning the North Sea into that green energy hub, in addition to the windfall tax on oil and gas, which is not particularly popular, obviously. Another area of misalignment, obviously, is ETS, emissions trading schemes. I really don't want to go into that too much in detail because it's incredibly complicated, although I'm sure you have a very erudite audience who knows all about it. But certainly the UK government has been under pressure from industry to align its ETS scheme with that of the EU to really try to remove additional border bureaucracy. And I think where the pedal's going to hit the metal will be the concerns about the impact of the UK's decision to introduce CBAM, its carbon border adjustment mechanism, in probably 2027, so a full year later than the EU. So try to pull a degree of alignment between those two, I think, would be very, very helpful, beneficial for both sides. Might require dynamic regulatory alignment. Marc touched a little bit on what some of this might look like. So whole systems regulatory approach, intermarket approaches, network reforms, and reforming market structures, all good. But they certainly take a long time. But I think there are potential areas for cooperation. We mentioned before that the UK is now, if somewhat inadvertently, a massive gas transit state, receiving and sending gas onto Europe as a result of conflict in Ukraine. But I think it's something of a unified market, if you like, with Europe in terms of price trends and levels, not always necessarily in a good way. If you look at the emergence of policies here, I think the EU's emerging green industrial policy is roughly at the same area in terms of development as the UK's own industrial policy. So I think an obvious opportunity would be to try to make sure that those two policies are talking to each other in the area of energy. So the EU policy has got, clear principles that align very nicely, I think, with Labour's leitmotifs: selectivity, firm neutrality, market structures, recoups, etc. I think the Commission's recent competitiveness compass is what they call it. I think that's a really good proposal for public procurement, that the sort of buy-European approach that actually does, I think, align nicely with a broader buy-Europe approach that could include the UK. They're going to be doing it in terms of defence. I cannot see why they wouldn't do it in terms of energy security. And then I think, just to finish, although the previous question and Sid had this one on defence, there's an enormous amount in terms of cooperation in terms of the UK and Europe on energy security, coordinating on infrastructure. And I'll just mention very, very briefly the work that they do together on a whole variety of critical critical undersea infrastructures. I think the one that really springs to mind is the UK-led Joint Expeditionary Force. So we think of this obviously as stricto sensu security and defence, but the idea of the new initiative that's coming from Jeff called the Nordic Warden. It's a great name, to track threats to the Baltic Sea infrastructure. Excellent. And this has been followed very recently by NATO's Baltic Sentry operation. Again, that's conceived by Baltic Sea leaders very recently, but with good UK support. So I'll end there. I think it's a sort of a mixed picture in terms of some clearly protracted areas of misalignment, but very real areas of opportunity as well.
So just to follow up, I mean, do you see any prospect of the kind of new emergent kind of collaboration over defence and Ukraine spilling over into areas like energy, infrastructure, security, but more energy policy and especially security questions within energy, which can go quite broadly, so to Russia, but also to China, and all of those kind of quite fundamental issues where if there is non-alignment, you could have really quite significant problems in supply chains and...
Yeah. No, you're exactly right. I do, actually. I think, interestingly, the two-day NATO summit that concluded in Brussels last week had, enormously important amounts of security and defence, as we would imagine, but a lot to do with energy security infrastructure as well. And my feeling is that UK leadership of Jeff and a broadening, clearly naval, Baltic-oriented area of activity is something that the European Union and the UK within NATO, so it's a sort of series of concentric circles, if you like, have to put together at this point. Otherwise, whatever takes place next in Ukraine is simply not going to be viable. There was a lot of talk last Friday in Brussels about the grey zone, So I'm interested to see how much energy security and energy infrastructure are now being rolled into quite traditional forms of energy security in terms of discussions with NATO and being able to ensure that, you know, UK and EU leadership together are capable of pushing back on that.
Well, thank you very much. So we have a few minutes for questions. We have one from Mike here, and then we'll take two. We'll take them individually.
Yeah, thank you. Mike Ford from the Oxford Institute. Just really got a comment. Question the consensus that gas demand in the UK and Europe is going to fall, let's say, in the next 5 years. I think certainly Repower EU was a fantasy when it was first proposed. So, you know, European gas demand is not going to fall that rapidly. In the UK, especially in the power sector, in the UK, over the next 5 years, we're going to close more nuclear than we're going to open up. So that there's a big hole in in supply of electricity. So it's difficult to see, the clean power by 2030, heroic assumption would be the kindest thing to say about it. And also in Europe, there's a lot of coal plants closing in the next 5 years in Europe, which will give a sort of boost to gas demand, notwithstanding the growth of renewables, which does look a bit optimistic. So I would question the fact that gas demand is going to fall over the next 5 years in UK and Europe, and even the next 10 years. So I think we should be planning on the basis that gas demand could well stay at current levels as a sort of fallback plan, rather than assume it's going to fall, therefore we'll need less gas.
Yeah, interesting point. Should we take the gentleman here, and then lady next to him, and then we'll go over here?
Yes. Chris Cook, I was until recently a senior research fellow at the Institute for Strategy, Resilience and Security at UCL, and I actually got that role because I attended an event here in 2009, and I spent the last 15 years or so with the background. I designed the UK natural gas futures contract back in the 95-6, and I've been involved in high-level hydrocarbon policy in the Middle East, but more recently in resilient markets locally. And what I've got to say is we have an opportunity to create a new generation of markets. I call them smart markets, rather than buying and selling electrons for profit and buying and selling carbon molecules for profit. We have an opportunity to actually look at what the Danes did, which was to look at the end use and then say, how can we have the least carbon fuel cost to achieve that end use, which is the only rational resilience policy I've seen globally, and it leads directly to distributed networks. And I think UK alone, because of the nature of our legal system and the possibility that we have of, shall we say, non-binary markets is a way of looking at it, we can actually come up with a complementary market, swaps. I don't mean contracts for difference. I mean, you supply gas to Grangemouth, which is just over the hill from where I am, and you do a percentage swap in terms of the production of product. Gas for power, gas for product swap. You can have a gas for power swap. Having created those flows of value, you can simply come up with an energy loan. What's an energy loan? Prepayment. You'll never get people to do that. £8 billion of energy loans exist in this country already. Poor people are prepaying interest-free, funding the utilities, and actually getting energy in return. And I talked to a pension fund in Hamburg about this, a big one, and he said that is a perfect pension fund asset class. Okay? I think we have an opportunity in the UK to do the undoable previously, because we have a unique flexibility in our legal and financial system to think the unthinkable and do it. And I spent the last a bit more years doing this, and we've actually got quite a bit to say, but I haven't been able to say it till now. Sorry.
Thanks. I think some thinking the unthinkable will be needed in going forwards. I think there's a question next to you.
Hi, Jess Ralston from the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. I was wondering whether the panellists could answer a question about politics. And we're obviously seeing Kemi Badenoch say net zero is impossible. Nigel Farage, not a fan, I don't think. So there's quite a lot of rowing back on net zero. And from what I've heard today, actually net zero is seen as the solution to energy security and to get energy independence. And so how helpful is it to hear these big politicians rowing back on something that I believe is what we're saying is going to deliver energy independence?
Okay, so I think if we respond to the kind of 2 comments and question, and then we'll take the remaining 2, I think there are 2 further questions. Yeah. If anyone wants to...
Just maybe to start with on Clean Power 2030, I mean, at Aurora, we do not hold the government's assumption on renewable deployment. That being said, so we don't reach necessarily like, I think it's like 50 gigawatt of offshore wind by 2030, because, I mean, it is virtually impossible in the current framework with the current supply chain, etc. However, even with the sort of like planned deployment of additional onshore wind, offshore wind, solar, like the next allocation round, which is about to kick off like very shortly, that is actually a lot of additional generation. That's one thing. And on the other end, and maybe something that should I make clearer, but like, even though I do see like in the long run demand going up, in the probably like the next couple of years, even power demand is unlikely to go up. And I think that because of the same issue that will affect gas is that we see a lot of industries closing in the UK, and actually that is a driver like for demand in general. So I'm not saying that gas demand will collapse, but there was a strong rationale for like gradual decline of gas from the power sector because of a switch from gas to renewable, but also like some kind of like lower industrial demand, and then the rest is also like energy efficiency, for instance, and then some electrification, although I do agree that over the next 5 years, we should probably not overplay the rate of electrification. It will take a bit of time to gain some momentum. And then maybe I can like discuss a little bit on net zero. I think the devil is a bit in the detail on net zero, like how net is net, what is zero exactly, because I think it really depends what you include in all your assumptions and your definition of what that is. And we can see it, for instance, like quite short term, the concept of Clean Power 2030 is actually a very pragmatic approach at how you can get your grid, your power grid to be clean. A year ago, up to a year ago, the previous government, Conservative government, actually had as a target to get to a clean grid by 2035, and by clean they meant actually like zero emission. Now we have a different government whose new definition is clean power by 2030, and clean is actually not fully clean, right? There's some remaining gas, which is what I mentioned. There's like about 5% left for gas. So it's kind of like a pragmatic approach to making sure that this is in a way doable. And so same thing for like net zero. Net zero is actually doable, but you need to have like some negative emission to offset some positive emission, potentially from unabated gas or things like that. Now, to the cost, and because I feel like ultimately that is the issue that is raised by some parties or some politicians, net zero can be cheaper or as expensive as not doing net zero. I think the one thing to bear in mind here is that it's very easy to not do it right, and on the way create shocks to the system that will be very costly. For instance, if you deploy too much renewables too soon while your grid actually cannot cope, then you'll need to pay billions for constraints in your system. And that is suboptimal, and that will lead potentially to some backlash. So I think that is just getting like everything in sync, and that is quite complicated with net zero. So
yeah, just on Clean Power 2030, I think it is worth remembering. Well, I say worth remembering. I mean, I heard Ed Miliband speak in, I guess, before the election, and he was quite explicit in saying, 2030 is an ambitious target, and really this is a theory of government thing, that to mobilize the machinery of government, you have to set almost unrealistic targets. So basically what he wanted to do was hit the Department of Energy and our energy security net zero with a shock and get everybody moving immediately to push as hard as they could, as fast as they can, to get as close as they think is feasible. So I think when people have taken it very literally, and I guess you should, it's government policy, but I think it is important to remember that Ed Miliband himself has said explicitly that that is what they're trying to do with Clean Power 2030. And it is kind of a mode of basically from his first time in government and the whole Tony Blair kind of delivery units trying to think about how you get government to do things. That is one of the reasons why it's there and it's so demanding. Amelia, I don't know if you had a view or wanted to comment on the political question.
Yes, I'll start with the Repower EU, if I may. These things are always a product of their time. But I will say, I mean, this is an extremely effective combination of foreign policy on the one side and energy security on the other, put together by the former High Representative and Vice President Josep Borrell. And it's laced, you know, with values and norms about pushing back against not just Russia, but, you know, maintaining European democracy, this in an energy structure and an energy program, if you like. And I think it really was, you know, effective in as much as possible, reducing, never turning off the, you know, shutting off the Russian gas taps completely, but certainly reducing gas and then increasing energy efficiency and renewables. So as a program, I think it was actually really very successful. Nothing is ever going to remain in position forever, particularly when the political stakes themselves over Ukraine are shifting. But I think if you look at some of the mechanisms that it produced, including the EU purchasing platform, there I think you see positives in terms of the EU's ability to be an aggregate purchaser. That's something that is going to be incredibly important, you know, in the months and years to follow, about energy actorless, if we can call it like this. And Jess, I think you've really put your finger on the question. Is it particularly helpful? No, it's not. It's fundamentally unhelpful. Particularly if net zero is being held up as, you know, as the panacea for absolutely everything. The problem is, of course, you've got, as Dan has mentioned, you know, le choc. You've got the highest possible bar being set by politicians, not just to wake up the public diplomacy aspect, but, you know, to kickstart Westminster and Whitehall, at least in the UK. And yet, of course, there's going to be this understandably pragmatic mid-range area where you see what actually happens when you put these policies into practice. And however positive they may be, it's going to take time, it's going to take money. There's going to be very real questions in terms of public diplomacy. Particularly when the costs, you know, come through the other end of the pipeline. But I think if you're serious about it, you continue to have to maintain. You have to continue to maintain that bar, rather than better to bump your head on the bar on going under it, if you like, than tripping over it. But I think also, and I'll finish on the point that Dan initially gave me. It's a good opportunity for the UK and the European Union to try to close ranks together. They both need to be pragmatic and integrated as energy partners.
Thanks. So we're kind of at time, but I will take there were two questions earlier on. Sorry, I'll just take the two that were here earlier, just so we can get them in. We'll try and answer super quick, or just hear the comments. So I had one here and one here. Okay, well, you have the microphone. So
I'll start. Just a couple of points that I'd like a response to. The question was about, is this the end of pipeline gas? Russian pipeline gas, but Europe has actually been buying LNG from Russia, more of it, even if the gas pipelines have been reined back. So, I mean, are we actually asking the wrong question? That it's okay to protest, as it were, to use pipeline gas as an object of protest, but gas itself is absolutely fine. The other question I had, which was really about whether it's really an end to, maybe if pipeline gas, then maybe not other gas. Because I was in Germany for the election, and you quoted a German response as saying back to Russian pipeline gas would be the wrong direction. It seemed to me that both in the last stages of the election and after the election, the Russians were quite quickly on the phone to the Germans saying, actually, we could we could resurrect Nord Stream 2 pretty quickly, and that the response from Germany was not no on no account, but it was actually quite, well, I would say it was quite open, both on the political side, not just from the extreme right, but also from public opinion, and that surprised me.
Well, thanks. And we'll just take the question over here, and then we can we'll wrap up with the final comments.
Thank you. So you mentioned three sectors in which LNG is quite important right now. So heating, electricity, and industry. And you mentioned some alternatives for the first two, so heat pumps and renewables. Can we go into the industry part? What are the main kind of uses there? What are the possible alternatives? And how would you kind of stack rank these three sectors in terms of difficulty for kind of getting off LNG or gas in general?
Thanks. So I think mostly questions for you, Jack.
Yeah. Okay. So, Mary, to your questions. So, firstly, you're right regarding the fact that obviously, as European imports of pipeline gas from Russia have declined, we've continued to import Russian LNG, and that actually the volume of Russian LNG coming into Europe did increase since 2022. There's a very particular reason for that. So firstly, with regard to the decline in pipeline supply, as I tried to sort of summarize, it wasn't the result of a European protest against Russia that we, sort of chose to stop taking this Russian gas. It was actually the result of multiple factors that interlinked. And some of it was sanctions, some of it was commercial, some of it was pipeline capacity, and it all created the bigger picture, if you like. I think that from the German perspective, so you're absolutely right, it was Robert Habeck that I was quoting. I think that from the German government perspective, one difficulty, let's say, is the German government had to spend a lot of money bailing out Uniper in 2022-23, because Uniper, for those who are less familiar, was a very major importer of Russian pipeline gas, buying it from Gazprom, receiving it via Nord Stream. And when the Nord Stream pipeline was sort of curtailed and then ultimately closed in 2022, Uniper didn't get the supplies that it needed, and it had to go out into the spot market at a time of exceptionally high prices and buy replacement volumes, which came very close to bankrupting the company, frankly, and the German government had to step in and bail them out and effectively nationalize the company. They're in the process of trying to re-privatize it. In addition to that, the German government also put a lot of money behind the new floating storage and regasification units that have been installed in Germany for the explicit purpose of buying LNG as a replacement for Russian gas. I think it would be quite difficult politically, potentially, for the German government to then sort of walk that back and say, okay, good German people, we spent all your taxpayer money bailing out Uniper and building these FSRUs, but by the way, we want to welcome Gazprom back into the fold. I can understand some elements of public opinion where people are told, look, if you allow Gazprom to use Nord Stream 1 again or rebuild it and start flowing, gas prices will come down. Well, anybody that's asked in present times, do you want to pay less for your energy, is probably going to say yes. But I think we should be aware that is off the back of a couple of years, well, several years, last 4 years really, of exceptionally high gas prices in Europe since the late part of 2021. But by the time we get to, let's say, 12, 18 months from now, the LNG wave will be very much on our shores, and gas prices are likely to be notably lower than they are now. So it is a time-limited argument to say that if we open the gates to Gazprom back into Europe, we can bring prices down, let's say. Do you want to take the question on gas consumption by sector? Or?
Pretty quick.
Sure, yeah, very quick. I think there was a question about the ranking of and so, like, how easy it would be to switch away from gas in each of the sectors? So, I mean, one, power is like the easy, like, first candidate, not necessarily because it's the cheapest, but because it is the easiest for policy intervention usually. Then everything that has to do with like buildings and especially residential is quite a difficult one to touch on because of voting patterns at the end, so you don't want to scare people off. And for industry is not like one block, right? So like it's a spectrum. And I think the best way to think about that is to look at like what is setting like carbon prices, and you can see like which sectors are like the easiest to abate and the ones that are like the most difficult ones. Usually for gas, there are like a number of sectors where gas is used for like high heat, and that is the most difficult for like to remove gas away from those sectors, when just gas is like used for like I don't know, conventional heating temperatures, then it's a lot more easy to either electrify or switch something different.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there just because we're over time. But thank you very much to the panel. Thank you everybody for joining us today and sticking to the end. And yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you.